Tonight, your chance to get even with Barty. His mother-in-law's visiting with us tonight. He didn't want to introduce her, but you want to get even with Barty tonight. Next month's speaker approached me about coming. Dr. Beck wants to come back. I'm sure some of y'all remember him. He has a new book out called Van Dorn's Raid on Holly Springs and How It Saved Vicksburg. And so he's going to be our speaker next month. When you get a speaker, you can't wait for 4 weeks. You have to get them several months ahead. And most of the time I say, okay, well call me when it gets closer. Well, so you got to call him when it gets closer. And the worst case scenario is when you get a call, I'm on my way over here. Hey, Mark, there's a wreck on the high interstate. I'm still in Memphis. But he easily could have said, I'm not going to be able to make it, but he went the extra mile and made it. Some of y'all remember this fella, that last time he was with us is when Obama became our commander-in-chief, and he had a few choice words about that, but we don't want to go into that tonight.
Oh, no.
But I appreciate him coming, and once again, we'll welcome, give a tiger welcome to Mr. Jimmy Love from Bartlett, Tennessee.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be down here with the Tip of Tigers. I got to say, there are a couple more people here than there was the last meeting I was at. I sure wish my camp had this many members. I do want to start out by giving you a little preview about what you folks are in for with this talk, by something my grandma said to me many years ago. Boy, don't you ever shut up. So, I hope I don't keep you here too long and wear you out too bad. My area of interest in the war is not so much in the war itself. I bet any one of you folks out here could just eat my lunch over things that went on during the war. I mean, there's people who can tell you what time of day General Lee's horse belched, but I can't do that. I was more interested in what brought us to war and why things happened the way they did after the war. And I had quite a few talks with my grandma about that because it was on the record of her grandfather that I got into the SCV. And I see that your unit here, the Tip of Tigers, was at Fort Donelson. So was my boy, Andrew Jackson Brown. He was captured and sent to Camp Douglas, Illinois. And my grandma told me that he recalled very well how they were on a train and the Union people were shooting into the train cars as they were passing through the town. So things were pretty ugly. When I was a little boy, I asked my grandma, Mammy, why did we go to war with them? He said, well, boy, I guess we just didn't play too well together, did we? No, we didn't. So that had always puzzled me, and I kept hearing this business about slavery, but the more I looked into it, I thought, well, slavery was it was an issue with some people, but it just really wasn't that big of an issue. The United States is the only country in the world that has ever had a war fought where there were some people said that slavery was the issue. No other country has done it. I mean, there's other countries like Brazil. Of course, slavery was used as an issue for an emotional appeal, just like it was used here in our country. I kind of look at it still, call me crazy if you will, but I got to feel, the way I feel about it, they have their country up there and I have mine down here. And Tennessee's my country. Mississippi's your country. Heck, I like coming to Mississippi, but I got to tell you, I sure did not enjoy my stay in the People's Republic of Massachusetts. Had a little bout with some ladies there in the Mayflower Society. They kind of got uppity with me when I told them I was in the Jamestown Society, so things just went worse from there on. And we wondered, like I said, I wondered why the war started, and you have to go back to the very beginning. When did the first incident happen to start this war? I tell you, it happened in the year 1620 in Plymouth, Massachusetts. when those heathen pilgrims set their nasty feet on that rock there. So, they were very different people than our folks who came to Jamestown 13 years earlier. Some of the differences is that they were mainly an urban people, a city people. Our ancestors were mostly from the countryside. And to show you just how starkly different we were, our people moved from the East Coast in Virginia and the Carolinas, and we reached the Mississippi River before the Pilgrims people made it 50 miles west of Boston. So our people tended to spread out. We tended to be more self-reliant. We relied on our land, to fill our needs, whereas the northern people relied more on a money-based economy. That started problems right off the bat. As far as the slave issue goes, well, we all know there were slaves everywhere. Every colony had slaves. There was a lot of whoop-de-doo, I remember, about one of my northern friends said, well, we freed our slaves up here. I said, no, you're wrong. You didn't free a single slave up there. Just like the Emancipation Proclamation freed no slaves. What you did up north was you made slavery illegal up there. And you gave your good people a year to sell your slaves down the river so that you wouldn't lose any money. You were very concerned about losing money in your property. But you didn't want to give the South, that same sop there. You didn't want to let us find a way out of slavery without losing our shirts on it. Because, let's face it, most of the South's money was tied up in slave property. You take away the slaves, the South was bankrupt. So it wasn't quite so easy as to just say, well, let's turn some people loose. The humanitarian side of you says, yeah, do it, do it. But how many of us are going to be humanitarian enough to put ourselves and our family in poverty and wondering where your next mouthful of peas is going to come from? I doubt that there's very many people on the face of the earth that would do that. So we started out, like I said, with a stark difference between our people, and by the time of the American Revolution, George Washington, along with Thomas Jefferson, most of the Virginians and the Carolinians and the Georgians, who were leaders of the South then, they had some very healthy-sized problems with Yank. George Washington thought that the Yankees were dirty, uncouth, and dishonest. They bore him out. They seemed like they were in a contest to see which one could be the dirtiest, the most uncouth, and the most dishonest. He had several of his officers arrested for embezzling money from their company's mess funds. And these guys, coincidentally, were from Massachusetts. There was never a time when George Washington's feelings abated on that issue, and neither was Jefferson's or any of the others. John Randolph of Virginia tried to warn us about going into a union with the Northerners because he said it's not going to work. They're going to try to overwhelm us. Well, after the Revolution, of course, things were rocky from the beginning as a country. One of the first big issues we had was the War of 1812. Now, I'm not going to take these people to task so much for it because they did what a sovereign state has a right to do. But the state of Massachusetts refused to participate in the War of 1812 and refused to send any troops. They weren't too hot about the war because it interfered with their trade. New York, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, they were all suffering financial loss because of the embargo that we had on the trade with the English. They met in Hartford, Connecticut, and determined that if things didn't go more their liking, that they were going to secede from the Union. The first effort at secession wasn't us. It was them. They thought it was just fine and dandy then. And my thoughts were, hey, it was fine and dandy with me too. If they want to leave, I don't want them to stay where they're not wanted any more than they do. The only thing that prevented the northern states from seceding from the Hartford Convention was that everything hinged on the state of New York. It was the Empire State then, and New York politics controlled everything in New England. The plan was to have Aaron Burr elected governor of New York, and he would lead New York into secession. Well, he was defeated by Alexander Hamilton. Then they had their duel. Hamilton gets killed. Burr is persona non grata, and he hauls out and ends up, I think, in Texas somewhere, trying to start a country of his own. But they came just very close to seceding back then. We didn't have any problems over the issue of secession. Everybody understood that it was the right of a state to secede. A state, keep in mind, as you guys and ladies know, is its own separate country. We were a union of countries, and our relation to the federal government was the federal government was just an arbiter. Well, over the years, it got to the point where the northern folks felt like the states were just tributaries of the federal government, kind of like counties are to the states now. Their political thought was shaped by this process, and Daniel Webster of Massachusetts came up with this fiction that the Union came first, the states came later. I got to tell you, I scratched my head about this quite a bit, thinking about it, and thought, how can something be created before its creator has been created? Well, that's Yankee logic for you folks. I don't understand it any more than y'all, but that formed a big part of their political thought up there, was that the federal government was supreme. And they thought that the federal government existed to benefit them financially. I don't know if you folks know this, but more than 80% of the federal government's revenues came from tariffs off of imported goods. Now, the South was overwhelmingly the big importer. We sold our cotton to England and France, and we bought their finished goods. Farming equipment, clothes, fabrics, and shoes, you name it. The English and the French produced higher quality goods than the Yankees did, and they sold it for less. Plus, they would give us more money for our cotton. So we were having a booming business here. Unlike what Yank would tell you, the South was booming before the war. I mean, we were booming. Now, out of all that money that we were sending up to Washington, D.C., you folks got any idea where it was being spent? That sure wasn't in Mississippi. And I guarantee you it wasn't in Tennessee either. It's been estimated, I've seen different estimates, between 80 and 90% of the federal monies that were spent was in the northern states. We were building canals for them, dredging their harbors, building paved roads for them, bridges. The things that our people were doing for ourselves, they were having the federal government do for them. And who was paying for it? Our people were. We chafed at the bit quite a long time on that. You may remember our patriot John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, who fought that great battle over the tariffs in the 1820s, when the South first threatened to secede from the Union. So the money issue was a big issue. We have seen the social issue, now we have the financial issue, and that political issue there. All of our thoughts were so radically different. And European visitors that I've seen who have written about America they have all noticed, the real stark difference between the people of the North and the South. Now, as far as another part of the social issue was race relations. If you listen to the mainstream media these days, you get the idea that race relations in the South are the worst in the country. When actually, the opposite is really true. Every foreign visitor to the United States remarked that racial prejudice was much greater up north. To illustrate that, I tell you that several northern states, one of them being Abraham Lincoln's home state of Illinois, amended their state constitutions to make it illegal for black folks to immigrate to their fair lands. It's a matter of public record. You can go up and look at it. Ohio was in on that, Michigan. And, you know, so much for the brotherly love that our northern neighbors felt towards our black brothers and sisters. They despise black people. And as a matter of fact, Timothy Pickering, the Massachusetts politician who opposed the Louisiana Purchase, complained that it would bring into the Union this mixed breed of, I think he called it mutants, who are proliferating at such a rate that they will very soon outnumber us here in the north, and they'll march up and conquer us and destroy our racial purity. Abraham Lincoln was a racist. He was the president of the Illinois chapter of the American Colonization Society, a group whose goal was to round up black folks and send them back to Africa. One of these black folks at the time said, "How are you going to send me back somewhere I've never been?" Well, I guess the same Yankee logic that said that something that was created before its creator was created, you know, that's that convoluted thought there. Later on when I got older, you know, I made a sly little joke about my grandma saying that we just didn't play well together. When I got older and could understand things a little better, she tried to explain it to me in this way, in that the Southern people wanted to play by the rules. We had a constitution. You know, it was a set of rules that we played by, just like a football or baseball game has its set of rules. But she said those folks didn't want to play by the rules. She said they wanted to bend, stretch, and twist the rules for their own benefit when we were just content to let things be the way they were. Well, as we go on in time, you have to keep in mind, too, that although slavery was a big issue in the United States, and there was quite a bit of discourse about it, it wasn't until 1831 that things started to get ugly. That's when William Lloyd Garrison started his newspaper, The Liberator, which was the most infamous abolitionist newspaper going. It was so bad, you know, Lincoln would not read abolitionist newspapers. His law partner, Thomas Herndon, was an ardent abolitionist, and he read all this stuff. And to show you again, you know, the problems with race up in the north, in Alton, Illinois, Elijah Lovejoy ran an abolitionist newspaper. The good people of Alton, Illinois went in and destroyed his presses several times, and he kept putting his paper back together until one day they said, you know, the only way to shut this dude up is to kill him. So they did. They destroyed his press and they killed him. And they did that because they didn't want anybody having a voice for the black people. Now, the abolitionist tone changed with William Lloyd Garrison. Instead of it being a group of people sitting around saying, you know, we got this problem with slavery. Yeah, we do. What are we going to do about it? Well, I don't know, but we got to keep in mind that X, X, and X, and X are problems here. They said, well, we don't see a way around it. So it was really just nothing being done about it. But a strange thing happened, and this goes into the political arena, and it goes all the way over to England. If you know anything about your history, you know that the English had a terrible problem with child labor over there. It was a huge scandal in England. The Queen of England was being pressured to have the industrialists to quit hiring his children to work 14, 16-hour days, 6 days a week. It was ruining the health of generations of English people. Doctors were predicting that there wouldn't be an able-bodied Englishman in another couple of generations if their children were being raised to work in factories like this. Their health was just being completely broken down. There was quite a number of English people who saw the injustice of that and the lack of wisdom in running factories with children. So they started some movements over there to make laws against child labor. But these industrialists were profiting quite a bit off the child labor. So, and they were also feeling quite a bit of social heat about this. So what were they going to do? You do what most anybody does. They want to turn the conversation. Well, somebody over here wants to talk about beans in Illinois. Somebody over here wants to talk about hogs in Mississippi. You know, somebody's going to turn the conversation. you got a problem, one of the easiest ways to take criticism off yourself is to turn the conversation. That's what these English industrialists did. And how did they do that? They started raving about slavery in the United States. They raved about it. And they didn't stop at raving about it and having their little newspapers over there print ugly articles about slavery in the United States. They financed abolitionists to come over from England. Some very notorious abolitionists like the Reverend George Bourne, who was run out of England just one step ahead of a rail. Harriet Martineau, another notorious abolitionist. Nobody knew really where they were getting their money. Where their money was coming from was a mystery. But I ran across a few records where there were some English payments made to American abolitionists. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the English crown was involved in this too, because they were still smarting over the fact that we kicked their butts twice. You know, kind of hard to get over that. You know, pride among a people is like pride among, you know, an individual. They got slapped down pretty good twice, and they were still smarting about it. And besides, the United States was now the major trade rival of the English. So it behooved the English crown to do something to keep this trade rival in its place. I don't have any proof of this, but I do think that the English crown financed some abolition activity over here as well. The French had had a bad taste in their mouth about the abolitionism with their Haiti experience, so they kind of backed off. And they were just this close to recognizing the Confederacy when the Russian Tsar said if England and France recognized the Confederacy, that Russia would go to war with England and France. So the Russians even had one of their warships make calls on American ports on the West Coast, in San Francisco and down the California coast. So we have that element in the political intrigue. It wasn't only the United States. This was the beginning, I think, of, you know, the world manipulating each other. Because communications had gotten so much better, I think, was what lended a little force to this fire. And here's another thing. This is going back to the financial realm. And I doubt that many of you out here even thought about this. But a burning issue of the time, and what they don't teach us about in school, was the Transcontinental Railroad. Well, at the time, there was a big debate about land that was going to be given to the railroads. The land was going to come from the territories of the United States, you know, that were west of Arkansas. And there were land grants given to railroad companies, and these grants were as big as some of the eastern states were, and in a lot of cases even bigger. Abraham Lincoln himself owned a lot of land over in Nebraska, and that's why they named the town Lincoln. I don't think it was because they liked the old boy so much, but he did own a lot of land, and he was speculating on his investment. The two railroads, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific, wanted the government to fund them. The South fought that tooth and nail. They said it's unconstitutional. Here's that old set of rules coming back and mess things up again, isn't it? We wanted to play by the rules, but they said, well, you know, rules and laws were meant to be bent and broken, weren't they? So yeah, let's have the federal government finance this. Well, over the South's objections, the federal government did get involved, did give out huge parcels of land, and they did give tons of money to the railroads. That's where corruption on a large scale in America began, was with these two railroads. Between the two of them, they formed this company called the Crédit Immobilier, which that company supplied, you know, rails and cross ties and tools and everything that a railroad needs was being bought from the Crédit Immobilier. Well, the Crédit Immobilier was doing what any good American company that's doing business with the government does. They're going to get as deep in the government's pockets as they could, by any means necessary. One of the ways they did this was they were going across the Midwest states laying track in the middle of the winter, on top of snow. when the spring thaw came, snow melted, the tracks disintegrated. They had to be rebuilt again. But it wasn't at the railroad's expense it was being rebuilt. It was at the government's expense. The government was having to pay them what they had already done. Now, after the talk, if any of you are interested, I'll give you a little preview of how that works on a smaller scale. I saw it when I was a park ranger at Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado. But by the time these two railroads met at Ogden, Utah, and drove the Golden Spike, at the minute they drove that Golden Spike in, united the East with the West, both railroads went bankrupt. Now, ain't that a marvelous thing? We have not seen corruption on a scale like that until we saw this Wall Street and this banking scandals happen within the last 2-3 years here, or since President Obama took over, you know, was when all this stuff was starting to come to a head. Now, I'm not getting political here. I'm not blaming Obama or anybody. I'm not getting into contemporary politics. It's just, you know, the timing of it is all I'm pointing out here. Up until that time, the railroad was a big scandal, and they had milked the southern states to the point where they needed more money. So they decided to pass another tariff law to raise revenue, the Morrill Tariff Act of 1860. That's M-O-R-R-I-L-L. That raised duties on everything across the board. But most of the duties were raised 250%. That means the tariffs that you were paying were 2.5 times as high as they would have been the day before. The South was squealing about that, just like they squealed about the railroad. They couldn't even get the government to divert the railroad a little further down south so the South could get a little bit of benefit from it. But we didn't have the numbers there. We just couldn't overcome the North's numbers in Congress. We had another thing happen on the social scene, the Dred Scott decision. I think most of y'all are familiar with the Dred Scott case, you know, a slave who had been moved by his master into Illinois, and he declared that he was free since he has moved to a free state. The Supreme Court ruled against Dred Scott, and that set the abolitionists on fire even more. It got to the point where when the presidential election 1860 came, Abraham Lincoln was elected as a sectional president. The South was terrified of him because he represented nothing but Northern interests. He did not carry a single Southern state, and his first act as president was to maneuver the South into firing on Fort Sumter, which started our war. And here's what I'm going to glide over. Like I said, you folks probably know much more about that than I do. But what was the aftermath of the war? Reconstruction. After Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, as vice president, was installed in office. And during the war, Johnson was a military governor of Tennessee, and he was very brutal about the way he carried on affairs there. And one of his first statements as president was that he was going to make treason pay, that he was going to hang traitors. He quickly changed his mind, and I got to give Johnson all the credit in the world for this. He started a liberal policy of granting amnesty to Confederate soldiers. And as a matter of fact, it sent the radical Republicans in a rage. They would hung him if they thought they could have gotten away with it. They attempted to impeach him. The impeachment articles failed, but he was a lame duck, unelected president. So he did all he could do. I have to give Johnson credit for not wanting to create a national police force. He didn't believe that the national government had any business being a police force. He predicted that if one was installed, that it would become an agent of oppression in the future. Talk about some of those details. I can't talk about it in SCV time here. Now, the corruption, it started with the railroads. When U.S. Grant was elected president, the lid went off. I mean, everybody from the Vice President of the United States down to the lowliest little congressman was caught up in some kind of scandal. Money, bleeding money off the government, cheating people. Our ambassador to the Great Britain, Robert Schenck, he had to be recalled from England because he had been over in England selling bonds in a company called the Emma Mine Company, and he knew it was a sham company. And he built millions of dollars out of English investors, and he had to flee the country. If he hadn't been the ambassador and had diplomatic immunity, they would have probably hung him over there. But that's how deep the corruption was running. Grant's brother, his brother-in-law, in fact, one of his brother-in-laws was Judge Lewis Dent down here in Mississippi, who was totally against Grant's policies, and Grant disowned him. The New York World, Horace Greeley's newspaper, said that it appears like Grant's more the brother-in-law and Dent is the man that we ought to be looking at. About this time, there was a mysterious organization that was running around the South, a secretive organization. Its members wore masks and hoods and costumes to disguise their identity, and they even disguised the identity of their horses by, covering them up when they went around, spreading terror, murdering people for political purposes. So, you got any idea who that might have been?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, it might not be who you thought it was, because that was the Union League. The Union League began in 1863 in Philadelphia by some good Philadelphia merchants who were kind of downcast at the North's fortunes in the war up to that point. It's kind of crazy that it should start there, because if there were any northern cities that had any southern sympathies, it was Philadelphia and New York City. But the Union League was formed, and they started sending their agents down to the South, and all the areas that were overrun by federal forces. The next people to come in were the Union League people, and they were enlisting the newly freed slaves, those who, were liberated from slavery to in the South, to slavery for the Union Army and slavery in the Union League. They had their mysterious initiation rites and practices, and they were spreading murder and mayhem across the South, and they were doing it undercover. The Union League was also drawing money from the federal government. They were drawing money from the federal government to register Republican voters in the South. Now keep in mind, the Republicans the party back then was a wildly radical liberal party. Socialist, and some people even say communist at the time. But here we have the government giving money to an organization for partisan political purposes. That was our first widespread use of it, and I think Acorn may have taken a cue from them. We went through 12 years of war after the formal hostilities had ceased. 12 years of this. Parson Brownlow was governor in Tennessee, who made war on his own people and put a bounty on the head of Klansmen, which a Klan was nothing more than a response to the Union League. Our people were being brutalized, our people were disarmed. The federal government was organizing militia companies off the newly liberated slaves, giving them arms and ammunition, telling them they had the right to kill at will, and they were doing it wholesale. You just don't hear quite a bit about it, because it's not the kind of thing that the establishment wants to promote. Our court historians certainly don't have any interest in promoting it, because they have their own agenda, and by bringing this to light, it would make them look like the bad guys that they really are. We went on through years and years of misrule, 12 years of it, until finally there was a disputed election in which Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican candidate. There were 3 states where the vote was in question. It was South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana. And as a matter of fact, Hayes was about to concede the election when somebody came up with a bright idea that said, hey, wait a minute, we haven't counted the ballots in these 3 states. So the Union League and the congressional diplomats descended on these 3 states, and they threw out vote after vote after vote after vote. And guess whose votes they threw out? The native-born peoples here. They threw our votes out. And even though they were throwing out votes wholesale, And they were taking voters from one state to another to vote. There were some, I've seen one guy who voted in 4 different states in that presidential election. But they were finally able to pull that scam off. It wasn't until there was a meeting between the southern politicians and the northerners, and they said, if you will accept the results of this election and install Hayes in office, we'll end Reconstruction. You're back in the Union. It's funny to me, how can you be back in the Union when they said we weren't out? I don't know, that's Yankee logic again. Things started to die down. The propaganda wars had just gone almost to nothing until 1898. The Spanish-American War happened. You know, the Maine was sunken in Cuban Harbor. The anti-South rhetoric stepped up again, and good Southern boys wanted to prove that they were super patriots, so Southerners enlisted in droves. And ever since that time, have always enlisted in droves in every one of American wars to prove that they were patriotic. After that war, the propaganda died down again until 1915. Then it started up again. I think what started it was the first moving picture. That was The Birth of a Nation. It came from Thomas Dixon's book about the South and Reconstruction, the Klan and all. The propaganda stepped up, Klan membership stepped up, and the Ku Klux Klan was the most powerful political organization in the United States. But it was running contrary to the Republican Party interests at the time. So the FBI was called in to break up the Klan, which it did with rather brutal methods. Then, magically, the propaganda died down again. And it didn't kick back up until just before the 1960 presidential election, when John Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, and then we started having anti-South rhetoric being stepped up again. And I want you folks to think about something. Do you know who the last conservative Southern president was? We haven't had one since James Knox Polk. He was president during the 1845 Mexican War. He was the president who installed term limits. He said, if you elect me president, I'll only serve 1 term. Well, he kept his word. He didn't run for re-election. He kept every campaign promise he ever made. The only president to ever do so. But that's been, golly, 1845 to now. Mathematicians, you figure that up how many years it is. But there's not been a conservative Southern president since then. But many of our issues here of today, we're being deluged with issues. We've got, you know, the financial scandals going on. We have political scandals going on. We have these so-called social ills. And all that is just like the abolitionist attacks back in the early days. It's a smokescreen to cover up the big issue of constitutional authority. Nobody's talking about constitutional authority so much anymore. And the last president to fight any kind of great constitutional battles was Grover Cleveland. And that was in the 19th century. That was more than 100 years ago. And we have not had a battle over constitutional issues. We've not talked about them. It's all degenerated down into these small little issues, and we're still sniping back and forth across the Mason-Dixon line. Well, I got to say, I'm going to close up here. I see I put about a half dozen of you to sleep already. So. Wake up! Wake up there, boy. Not all Yanks are bad. My partner, when I was with the National Park Service, was from rural Pennsylvania. The closest town was Mars. And we'd sit down in the chair watching television. I'd go back and look over him, start scratching the top of his head. He said, what are you doing? So I'm looking for your antennas, you stupid Martian. But this guy used to talk about, you know, Union and how we kicked your Southern butts and all this. And I did get to him quite a few times. I said, you know, you didn't whoop us. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, we whooped ourselves. He said, how'd you do that? I said, the Confederate Army won the world. Can you have, you know, some of the feelings you have about this government with your leanings? But you know, there again, I can't understand people all the way, but, there were quite a few northern people who actually did side with us. And you know who Harriet Beecher Stowe was, by the way? Other people, because I've seen some of our southern brethren down here who have quite a different view of things. I'm in a war on Facebook with one of them right now on a daily basis. Went to high school with him, and this guy defames his own people, his own family, and I just don't get it. In one way, I don't get it, but I really do. We all know that part of the social scene and here is the educational system. And we know how bankrupt it is, not only in money, even though they keep getting more and more from us every year, but they're bankrupt on the issues and the morality. I've seen so many things in high school history books that I know to be untrue, but all I can do is protest it. I hope I've done something more than bore you folks here. I hope that maybe you've heard something that you haven't heard before. If there's something here that I've touched on that you would like to get a little more information on, I have time, and like my grandma said, boy, don't you ever shut up. So I'm going to shut up now, but in closing, I want to say thank you once again for allowing me to come down here and meet with you. It's a really fine crowd here. I'm really impressed with it, and I can't wait to get back to Tennessee and tell my boys, you know, what a good show you make of it here in Ripley, Mississippi. Thank you very much.